So it's lesson 3 of enterprise computing. We're going to do a few different things this week. Going to sort of pick up where we left off with our music store. We're going to play around with controllers and views a bit more. We're also, this week we'll just sort of mock up a sample model. Next week we'll actually use the entity framework, the object relationship mapper that comes with Visual Studio to generate our classes directly from our database. But we'll just kind of mock one up for today. We'll see how that works. Start a class, I'm going to show you guys a little extension that's very handy in Visual Studio that I would recommend you install. We'll talk about that. I'll show you where to get it. The other things we'll do today, I'm going to review once again the process of getting your solution up onto GitHub and then deploying directly to Azure. I think we did at the end of last week's class. I'm going to go over it again because I know a few people are still having some challenges with that. The other thing we'll do is we're going to set up our SQL Server database. We'll kind of do that at the end of class. We won't be using it today, but we want to get it all set up so we can start using it next week. And I'll go through 2 different setups. One option is you can run it locally. It'd be faster to run locally. You don't need an internet connection to do your work. So that's the one advantage. I'll also show you how to set it up on Azure. Obviously, the benefit of running your database on Azure, not so much maybe for a music store, but for your assignments, obviously those databases need to run on Azure because you can't connect a live website to a local database. It's all got to be live. So we'll go through all of that. And I'm going to try my best, kind of worked in yesterday's class, try my best to kind of finish all our demos and walkthroughs by about 1:30, which hopefully should give me time to stick around and help anybody who's having configuration issues at that point. I'll try to make sure we've got some time for that. I'm also going to give you lab 1, which will be due Monday night. Pretty small, basically just making sure everybody can create a new app, get it up and running, post it to Git, get it online. That's kind of the idea. So I did make an announcement about this the other day. Oh, I did not make an announcement about it the other day. Okay, I guess I'll do it now. Let me just send out this link. Sorry about that. I thought I had sent it out in an announcement. Oh, maybe I just posted it in Weekly Learn in Tools and Resources. Bear with me for a second. Ah, I did. Okay. So it's not an announcement. Inside of Weekly Learning Tools and Resources, here's an extension that I would recommend you might want to install in Visual Studio. I have not found, well, I found that the Git integration tools in Visual Studio are a good news, bad news proposition. The good news is when they work, they're super easy. The bad news is they often don't work. So I think I'm going to stop using the built-in the GitHub extension and the Team Explorer, and I'm just pretty much going to stick with the command line. So this is an extension that easily allows us to open a command line inside of our working directory from within Visual Studio. So I'm going to use this. I just find it makes life a little bit easier.
I don't think it's
Sorry?
I don't know if anyone else sees it, but it's not displaying.
It's not displaying for a very good reason, because I added it to the Wednesday section and not to today's section. So, sorry, I'll just dump it into Tools and Resources. If you refresh the folder, it should be there now at the bottom. So it'll just take you off to the Visual Studio Marketplace. So you may want to download this. You do have to, when you run the installer, Visual Studio has to be closed. And then you got, when you restart it, that's active. So all it gives us is you can click any folder. Typically, I'll do it right in the root of Solution Explorer. And you get this little, in the context menu, it'll add this option, open command line, and then you can use any one of these command lines, the administrator, PowerShell, or just the default one. So I find this way, this saves us, if we're going to do Git from the command line, we have to open Git and then browse all the way into wherever our project is. This just opens a command line and we're already inside our current working directory. So it just saves us a bit of time. Some of you already have Team Explorer working fine, or you installed the GitHub extension and it's working fine for you. Great. If you like using that, keep using it. but I'm going to, I like the control the degree of control we get from the command line. So I've already installed mine. So I'm just going to fire up Visual Studio and I'm going to open up last week's project. As I said, I'm not going to go through the process of copying and setting up new projects every week. I'm just going to keep on working. So if you weren't here, I assume by now you've gone to GitHub and gotten the current copy of the project. So what this little tool does, once you've installed the extension, if I just right-click my solution here, now I have this option. This extension gives me this open command line. And when I open it, I'm in my project folder, so I can just make new commits right here. Which is kind of useful. So I'll just minimize this. I'm not going to do, actually, we could try this. We could just see how this works. So open up your project from last week. Obviously, I'll make another commit at the end of class, but we'll just make one cosmetic change in the site now and commit it. So I'm just going to open up my layout file. So under shared and layout, I still have it open from last week. So here's how we left it off last week. So we made a couple changes to this file. We changed the title, we changed the primary link, and we added our store link. So we made those 3 changes. I'll just make another text change in here. So in my footer, maybe instead of saying my ASP.NET application, I'll just change some of that text on line 37. So something's different about the application now. Doesn't really matter what you put in here or what change you make, just change something. I don't need to rebuild, it's just an HTML change. We haven't changed anything in the C#. I go to my command window, I can just 3 quick commands and this will be our changes up on GitHub. So I'll just add all my files. Hit space add, space dot. And I'll make a new commit. So this is our commit from the start of lesson 3, and just a quick explanation of what we did. We changed the footer. We don't need to connect up the remote. We did that last week. Our application's already connected to our remote repository, so we just need to do one more thing, which is what? Yeah, just push. Git push from origin to the master branch, because we only have the dash U. No, you only want to use dash U. You only need that when you do your initial, your first upload. After that, not necessary. It won't harm it, won't break anything, but hey, it saves us 3 characters of typing, right? Space dash U. So we'll just leave it out. So it pushed, and if we go back to GitHub online, we should see that new commit now. Right, so is that 2 commits? Now we're at 3. So putting new work on GitHub should be as simple as that process. Use our little extension to open the command line, add the files, make a new commit with a description, and push. Done. It is important that your commit messages are descriptive. If other instructors haven't stressed that to you, you'll get marks for using proper version control on all my assignments. So, and that includes a few things. 1, that you've actually used Git. 2, that you've made regular commits. And the 3rd requirement is that those commits have descriptions. They don't just say commit 1, commit 2, commit 3. It's not helpful. When you break something, good luck going back to find the right version if you're not describing what's going on. Right? Should look instead right. So we have a COPA student. Right? This is the project he's working on. Here are his commits. So I can go in where we know if we've got a pull and older version, we know exactly what's happening in each of these. They're not called commit 1, commit 2, commit 3. So this is best practice, and I'd like to see everybody here using similar kind of practice. Anybody have any questions? How to get our stuff up? I will do this the end of class again, and we'll get it up. Did I put this up on Azure at the end of last week's class? Can't remember if I did or I didn't. Sorry? You're saying I did? All right. Well, I can always log into the portal and see if it's there or not. Actually, you know what? We'll check now. Again, I'll go through the process again. I guess I can go through it now. So if you have your code on GitHub, but you don't have it on Azure, I'll do a quick walkthrough of how to get it set up. And also we can see how that continuous deployment works. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. Hasn't been a good week for them. The Imagine store was offline the other day. Anybody else access the Azure portal? Do you get the same response? Give it a try. You're able to? And clearly doesn't like me. Interesting. So here was the site I set up last week. And we can see how the continuous deployment options work. If your repository is set up on GitHub and it's not yet on Azure, we should be able to try it this way. I'll have to come back here. So we just go to New, choose Web App. We may have to revisit this later, because there's not very much I can do if the portal doesn't want to cooperate. Okay, we're going to revisit this later. I can only spend so much time waiting for web pages to load properly. Okay, so we'll go back to our solution. Let's get it launched locally. Let's run it locally. So you can use either the start debugging or start without debugging. I always recommend you use the without debugging so that we don't constantly have to stop and start the server. So start it without debugging. It'll kick off our app in our default browser. So here's where we left off last week, right? We made a couple changes, cosmetic changes here. We added a store link. We created a store controller with a couple of views, and we hard-coded these elements in. So when we pick one, we get it on the next page. So we're going to overwrite some of this stuff today. We're going to modify it, and then we're going to modify it again and overwrite it again next week. So in this page, we've hard-coded this list in. Today, we're going to kind of mock up some data just in memory and use a loop for printing that data out. And then next week, we'll fetch it actually from our SQL database instead. Store page will look something a little more like, we want this list to dynamically come out of the database. So we'll do that. We also have, along with this tutorial, they gave us some assets, like some images, like these placeholder images for the album cover, as well as a style sheet. So we can download that stuff as well. I'll put it on Blackboard and we can download it and see how do we add existing files from somewhere else to a current project. We're going to do that as well. So we've started to see, we kind of started to get used to some of the Microsoft's Razor syntax, right? So anything we see in here, for example, in our layout that starts with @. I want to talk about, kind of go over a few of the things we've seen so far, because we're going to be seeing some other syntax today when it comes to Razor. So we talked a little bit about this. We use this. So this was built in. As soon as we set up the template, it automatically gave us this. And then last week, we also used this object here in our browse view. What is the Viewbag? It's kind of a weird name. What does it do? Yeah, it's basically, it is an empty object, and what do we use it for? Yeah, we just use it to contain information, and typically that information is moving between where and where. Where does it move between in this instance? Yeah, so in between our views and our controllers. So we've got this kind of amorphous anonymous container where we can define our own properties and send them back and forth. Now, we've got a few other options. So we've used the Viewbag so far, and the Microsoft template even uses it. We've got some other objects as well. The session object, everybody would be familiar with. We can, again, write values into the session and then read them out. What do you suppose the difference is between Viewbag and session? So why we could have used the session object here to grab the genre name and then spit it out to the view. What do you think the difference is between using a session and using Viewbag for that? Could have used session. It seems like overkill. Has to do with the duration or life cycle of that object. How long does a session persist? Yeah, basically, as long as the user's active in the application, that session persists, right? So that value will travel with them from page to page, which is convenient, but there's a performance cost for the server having to remember that piece of data everywhere they go. Viewbag, the lifespan's a lot shorter. It's only for that current HTTP request. So we've got that value. As soon as the user refreshes, goes to another page, it's gone. So it's less resource intensive. So Viewbag is kind of like the most quick and dirty way of handing data back and forth. We'll use it a little bit. Most of the time, we're actually going to get into, and we'll start with using these next week. Actually, we may even do this a little bit this week, is a view model. So the difference is a Viewbag is untyped, whereas a view model is a strongly typed object. So we can hand an album object where we can access the properties and methods of that object. So typically when we're passing data from our controllers to our views, usually we're going to be working with strongly typed data that comes out of our database most of the time. And then the Viewbag is just for the little odds and ends, like passing messages or strings, or maybe the result of a quick calculation where we're not dealing with an object. So we'll start working with these today. We talked about what this does. In a nutshell, how would you explain this? If I asked you a question on a midterm test, what does the HTML action link method do? How would you answer that? Sounds like a pretty good question. I should write that one down. What's happening on lines 20 and 24 through 27? Yeah, it just generates HTML hyperlinks. So we don't see the HTML action link anywhere. We just see standard anchor tag. So why use it? Why don't we just write those anchor tags in? Why are we using that Razor syntax? Can be more dynamic, yep. Think about how navigation works in an MVC application. In a traditional, just a static HTML, CSS application, right? Each link is calling a particular file on the web server. It's just a link to a particular file. Here, our URL routing doesn't work that way. How does it work in an MVC application? Where does a link go? It doesn't just call some physical file. What does it do instead?
Goes to the controller.
Yeah, it goes to a particular controller defined here, and it calls a particular method. So using that action link, we're being really explicit that we're following the MVC pattern. We're not just linking to a file, we're calling a method somewhere in our application logic. We haven't seen this one yet. Well, what's this? HTML partial. Should be fairly self-explanatory. What's this? What would this do? And we can look at this file. Why would this be called a partial? Yeah, it's a component, right? So if we build a reusable component, if we want to let users log in 5 different places on the site, rather than build 5 login pages, we can create that as a control or a partial, and then we can just embed it. So this would really be the equivalent of a PHP include statement. Grab that file and just insert it here. Okay, so we've got reusable components. Render body, that just loads the body of the individual view inside our template. And we can also write C# functions, so you can probably figure out what that function does. So all this stuff, we didn't write any of this, we just used that template, and our layout, it uses all these functions. We'll do some other things in Razor today. So just looking at just want to show you a few of the examples of things we can do and stuff we'll try. So any code we can write in the C# window, we can write if we need to within our views. Typically we want to keep as much of that logic as we can in the controller, but we may still need some of it in our views. Hide this or show this, make a decision, evaluate something, calculate something. So all we would need to do inside of our view is prefix that code with an @ and then in curly braces, we can just write our server-side C# and it'll run. Same syntax, so semicolons at the end of commands. Loops, obviously this one's going to be big for iterating through a collection of objects or collection of data. Right? That's kind of, well, that's one way of doing it. So we can use for. We can also iterate through strongly typed objects using for each, right? For each item in a list. And that way by accessing them as a strongly typed object, we have access to all the properties. So we'll do this a couple ways today. One where it's untyped, and then we'll rewrite the code where that object is strongly typed, which is better, easier to code. So here's an example of what for each. We should talk about this for a minute, because it's a little bit odd. Usually, right, we're used to when we're iterating over collections, we usually have to define what that collection is. So if we've got a list of customers, we would think that in each one, we would declare this as a customer object itself. Notice in their code example here, and this is straight from the Microsoft docs, from the MSDN, it uses var instead, which is something we used to use a long time ago, and then most programmers decided we should get rid of var. Well, Microsoft's decided to bring it back, which many people, including me, don't like. Why wouldn't, so if we've got a collection called server variables, why would this say var instead of declaring item as a server variable object? Do you think this variable, this is going to be strongly typed or not? Sorry?
No, it's not going to.
You would think so. You would think that this means when we use var, just a generic variable, that therefore this is untyped and we won't have access to the properties and methods of that object. The reverse is actually true. We can use var, and yet this is still going to show up, be a strongly typed object, which seems completely, I see lots of frowns and people saying, how is that the case? It's not very intuitive. So what do you suppose happens whenever we use var? What is the the Microsoft compiler going to do?
Check what it is.
Yeah, it basically does type inference. So it will say, okay, well, if our collection is of type server variables, this object has to be a server variable. So you don't have to declare its type. We'll figure it out. I'm not crazy about this method, but this is typically what we're going to see in all the latest Microsoft docs, is using var in this instance, which is probably a little bit unfamiliar and uncomfortable for you. It is for me. And in Swift, it's the same. And I don't know, I think Swift did it first, and then Microsoft moved in this direction, but I'm not sure. If we looked at docs from 4 or 5 years ago, we wouldn't see var here. We would see a strongly typed, a data type here, but they moved away from that. So that's one thing I just wanted to point out because it's probably unfamiliar to you guys as well. We wouldn't typically do that in Java, right? We're going to define exactly what type of object we have. So that's a bit of a gotcha and something that may take a little while to get used to. So we can loop, we have the same kinds of syntax. So as much as we can, we're going to write this stuff in our controllers. We're going to try to keep as much of this logic out from our views, but occasionally we need to make decisions within the views, particularly about showing and hiding or making things accessible or unavailable to the user based on a certain condition. So the more we work with the syntax, the more familiar it's going to get. Okay. So what I want to do, I said I wanted to kind of change, just actually close up all our flags here. Actually, I don't want that. So all we want, today we're going to work with our store controller and with our store index view. This view where we've hard coded in these values from last week. So I'm going to take all of these out and we're going to mock up a bit of in-memory data instead. And then look at how do we hand that to the view, from the controller to the view, and use our Razor syntax to display it. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a model. Now this will be kind of, we'll make two models. They'll be fake models. We're going to, now we could keep them, but we're going to delete them because basically when we connect our ASP.NET, our MVC application to an SQL Server database, Microsoft gives us two choices. I think I've described them before. The first choice is code first, meaning we can define all our business classes in models, and then we can use the entity framework to convert those, each of those into a table in the database. We have no database. That's one model. The other model is where we already have the database first. So the process is called database first. We set up the database, and then we use entity framework to auto-generate our models out of the database. That's what we're going to do. We'll do that next week. But so just for today, we'll create a couple model files. Next week, we're going to get rid of them, and we'll let entity framework auto-generate them. So if you right-click your model folder, so we can look what's in here. There's a few, because we set up to use authentication, it's created already a few models around user management. So we're going to add a couple new ones. So there is no template for a model. In this case, we just add a class. And we'll just call this one genre. So our model definitions, much like in Java, they're typically singular, description of the noun, there's no S on the end. You can leave off the extension, it'll automatically assign the CS extension. So inside of the model namespace, we now have a genre class. So we'll just define one public property for today. We'll just define a name property with get and set methods. Microsoft has greatly shortened the syntax of having to write these get and set methods. Used to actually have to write a full method where when your set method had to take a parameter in and then it had to set the value. And the get method had to actually run a return statement. Now you just write get set and those properties are readable and writable. We'll make one other one. I'm not sure we'll really use it, but I'll explain in a minute why we're going to make it. Let's also make an album model. It's part of the same namespace. So our album model's got two properties. First one is a title. I haven't created Java classes for a long time. I can't remember. Is your declaration for a property the same as this, or do you have to do more in terms of writing the get and set methods? Or is it just like this? Sorry? You have to write like, yes, you have to write like a fully defined method. Yeah. So you used to have to do that. They've given us this shortcut, which is kind of nice. So if we want to represent a relationship, let's say we're going to have a relationship between albums and genres. So one genre holds many albums, but for the purposes of this database, one album can be in one and only one genre. We're not going to build it as a many-to-many relationship in this case. We would just represent it this way. So that's basically all we would need to do to represent that one-to-many. So our one side of the relationship has no reference. The reference is made in the many side. So when we use Entity Framework, as long as there's relationships in our table, which there will be, when we use Entity Framework, the database first model, to auto-generate our models, it's going to look something like this. Actually, I think if we go, let's just go to the source code, we can actually see what some of those completed models will look like. So here's what the genre model will look like eventually, right? We'll have a primary key, a name and description, and then a representation as a strongly typed list of the many side. So this is kind of the parent side of the relationship. That's what'll get generated. And our album model it will have the ID and then references to all of the parent fields, right? So an album will have both a genre and an artist. So is on the one side is also the parent with order details, because many order details can be for one album. So this is what our classes will look like when we auto-generate them based on our database model. It's kind of nice that we have the completed code here. We can always go and have a look at where it's going. So I'll just build that, recompile. We won't see any changes in our app yet. So all our models, they'll automatically get added here when we use our Entity Framework database connection. So now we want to go back to our store controller. So what we want to do here, programmatically, we're going to create, and remember, we'll just use a simple loop, and we'll create 10 genres. And then we can pass that object to our view, and then we can look at how do we iterate through and display that list dynamically. So here I could use var, or I could use int to declare a counter variable. We'll use int. I'm going to start at 1 rather than starting at 0, because I don't want my first record to be called genre 0, I'll make it called I'll have it named genre 1. Oops, sorry. I guess we need to create a type list first. So we want to create a new list, but it's not a generic list, it's a strongly typed list. So every object in that list will be of type genre and will have a name property. Now, one of the things I love about using Visual Studio is it will suggest fixes where it can. So notice it doesn't recognize genre. Namespace can't be found. So we have a genre class, but it's not visible here. And show potential fixes. It gives us a little light bulb with some ideas. Cool. So the first item, the first suggestion is the genre and album classes we created, right? We're inside the controller's namespace. These files are in the model's namespace. So there's no visibility right now. And it says, hey, if you just make a reference at the top to the model's namespace, then this file will know what a genre is. So I'll just click that. Error's gone. It now knows what the genre class is, and it added that reference at the top. Right? We could have manually put that in, but we don't need to. Visual Studio can point out the error and it can suggest the fix. Okay, I'm gonna do that again. So this is what we typed, right? Yeah. If you mouse over any error, it will try to give you some suggestions. See, there's a little yellow light bulb to the left of that the gray error box. If you click the drop-down arrow, it says, here are things you could try. Well, one is you could create a genre class, right? Because you're referencing a class that we have no knowledge of. But the other thing is it's saying, there is a genre class in here in this namespace. You know, I just choose the first suggestion, just click on it. And it adds that line of code to line 1. It adds it to the references in this file. So now this controller can access any of the models in the model's namespace. We can do this globally as well, I believe, but for now, we'll just let the code suggest, we'll just follow along what the code hit tells us to do.
It's showing error in the index, the public X1 index. Above the comment.
Where, what line number is the error, and what does the error say? Sorry?
13 number line 13 index.
So index is?
X1 return store controller index, not all code paths, these are return and value. Okay.
So you probably have this. Is your return inside of your loop? Because now I get that error. See, the way it works right now, it only returns inside the loop. It has to return the view always. Otherwise, the action never completes. So the return statement has to go outside of the view. So whenever you see that error, when it highlights the method name and says not all code paths return an action, it means your return statement won't necessarily run. And then the statement can't complete because the controller doesn't know where to send the user. So now we've got a list. We've created a strongly typed list. So now in our loop, we just want to add on a new genre 10 times. So as we loop around, we're going to create 10 items, genre 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 to 10. And this is correct, I guess. To be more correct, we should probably convert I to a string. It doesn't try to add a number to a string. So we're creating a list, and then we're just using a loop to populate that list. So when our loop finishes, we get down here, our genres list should contain 10 genres, each one with a name property being set. Okay, so this is a strongly typed object, even though we've used var. So now when we load our view, we want to hand this data, we want to hand this strongly typed list to the view. What would be the easiest way to do it? How do we send this collection back?
Doesn't to view.
Okay, so in here, pass it as a parameter. Okay. Seems like a good idea. So instead of using the Viewbag, which is untyped, we can call the view and say, by the way, here's a strongly typed list that we want to display in the view. So now we need to go and modify our index view. So I'll make a comment. So we should be able to compile that. Now, somebody asked a good question in yesterday's class. They said, if we have a relationship between genres and albums, is it possible, if we're going to pass the genres this way, could we also pass the albums along with it? The way that Microsoft's data model works, it's kind of neat. We don't explicitly have to. If we look at the full source code, right, the genre automatically contains a child property that has a list of all the related albums. That's one genre object. This, unless we exclude it, it gets included automatically. So when we query, genre rock, it'll give us the name and a description, but we get all the albums unless we explicitly say we don't need the child data. So we don't have to write joins or ask to include child data. It comes automatically unless we say we don't need it. We only want the master data because it's faster. We don't need the child data here. So we're passing this genre object. So we can try and write a loop. Now notice, so we're handing back an object called genres, yet in our view, the view isn't smart enough to know what that means, right? That genres object, it only exists, in the controller, but it doesn't know, the view doesn't automatically know what that value is. We could use the Viewbag like we did before. Actually, let's try it first with the Viewbag, but then we'll take it out. It will be actually, we'll just do it this way. Sorry. So let's take that out for now. Sorry, we won't bother using Viewbag. We don't need to really use Viewbag for a list. So what we need to do, just like in here, right? Our controller didn't know what this class was until we did what? We first tried to reference the genre model, said didn't know what it was. So how did we fix that? Yeah, we made a reference to the namespace that contained the genre, and then that type of data was visible. We have to do a similar thing on the view. If we want to represent strongly typed data, our view also needs a reference to that namespace so that it has access to that class. Set up a model reference here. So rather than referencing the namespace, we want to reference the genre class specifically. We're saying the model for this view, whoops, close, but it's saying, all right, we actually want, sorry, this needs to be a list. And it has a specific type, which Microsoft calls IEnumerable. IEnumerable basically means it's some kind of collection. Oops. I had to redo it. So IEnumerable, it's similar to an array list in Java, really. It's a collection, typically of, it can be untyped objects, but most of the time we'll want to make it as a typed object. So we have a model that is a list of genre objects as defined in our model namespace. So that reference is important because otherwise our view has no way of accessing that class, that type. So now our for each loop is going to look a little different. Because our model is of type genre, we can now access each item in that list. And our list should be strongly typed. So notice my list is strongly typed, so we now have access to the name property we defined in our class. We didn't define other properties. If we did, they'd all be here. So if we compile and reload our store homepage now, it should give us our 10 genres in a list. So we're looping from 1 to 10. Without this reference to our strongly typed list, our only other option is to stick the list in the Viewbag. But if we use Viewbag, it's not strongly typed. So It also means we don't get the code hinting because it doesn't know what kind of object we're trying to represent. And obviously we always want code hinting as much as we can get, right? Saves us time, saves us typing, reduces errors.
Sorry, is the model, is that model, is that pointing to the store control?
The model is saying that we have data being passed to this page that is in the form of a list, and that list is strongly typed. It's a collection of genre objects, and that we're setting it up. So we're setting it up in the controller, but we need to tell our view what kind of data is coming, right? Because this isn't typed. When we just say return view, it's getting data, but it doesn't know when it gets to the receiving end, the view doesn't know what it's getting, right? So it would be, it's sort of the difference between me giving you a box and me giving you a box and telling you what's in it so you knew what to do with it. Okay, so this is just, this parameter is just the box, but it's in effect a black box here. So we need this reference to define what that box contains as a strongly typed object. And then we can reference it. So in this case, we're using IEnumerable because we're sending a collection of data. If this was like a details page, so we can get a sense of what that might look like. So let's go here for a minute to. So here's a details view of an album. You notice our model is just based straight on the album class. So the difference in the declaration here and the one we did, here, our view is only working with a single object of type album. Whereas on our page, we're working with a collection of objects of type genre. So that model declaration is going to vary depending on what the point of our view is. Are we working with one record, or are we working with a list of records? When we're working with a list, our model is going to use the IEnumerable interface. We don't need this if we're working with one and only one record, say for creating, editing, deleting, or viewing a single record. And it's going to look like this. And just to show you again how with Viewbag we don't get the IntelliSense, we've used it here. So this is the about page that the template sets up for us. If I click type at Viewbag dot, right, there's no code prompt that comes up. So we can't see what is actually being passed and know whether we're accessing the right properties or not. When we pass a strongly typed object in with a model, like we did here, when I hit dot, we have access to what that object definition looks like. So that's going to reduce errors. So wherever possible, we're going to want to work with strongly typed objects and pass things that way. So our other option, don't change yours, because this is, William suggested we pass the genres, which I think is the best way of doing it, the way you suggested. Our other option, this is what it would look like with the Viewbag. I'm just going to kind of undo my stuff. I could say, don't change yours. I could just return the view this way and use Viewbag. So I'll just take that out for a minute. Then it would look something like this. So this will work, but I get no code hinting because Viewbag's untyped. So it has no way to access what this genres really means. I think I would actually just have to represent it that way. I'm not even sure. I don't know that I can even reference the name property. We'll see. Maybe I still have to put .name in there. We'll find out. Okay, that didn't work, so we'll try g.name. So it works with the Viewbag, but it's not as explicit, and we have no code hinting when we do it this way. So when we're working with data, we don't really want to use the Viewbag. Our original method, I think, is better. Now, we did remove one piece of functionality from this as well. What functionality did we have in this last week that's now gone? Yeah, they're not links anymore. So we want to take these values that come out of our controller, but we do want to put them back as links. So we can click and it'll take us to the browse page, and the browse page will display the name of the genre the user clicked on. So let's look at that syntax. How do we take a server-side variable and wrap it in a link? So I'm just going to take this out, and we'll use the HTML action link. So what's the text of our links? What should the text of our link say? Right, we still want it to look like this, but we want these to be clickable. So the first parameter of our action link method is the text to display in the link. So we want the name of each genre. So how do we reference that? Right. Again, it's strongly typed, so we can access g.name. And again, our code hinting is useful because it gives us the definition of the property when we select it, right? It gives us the data type, shows us that it's readable and writable. What action do we want to call? We've only got two actions. So which of these actions are we calling? Index or browse? Yeah, we want to call browse. Which controller contains that action? Yeah. We want to pass in but we had previously hard-coded in the genre names. Now, whatever the name is on the link, we're passing that value. So if you refresh your page now, all of the genres should be links, and when you click one, it should take you to the browse page, and it will say albums for and include that name. We'll just try it out. Looks pretty good to me. So they're links. So that's kind of the idea. Okay, so here's our code. So this is a very stripped down of what our views might look like if we were building this with some other kind of technology. Right? We looked at this before. So here was our PHP version, right? It had all the logic for connecting and running our query. And then our output, we had to do this. Loop through, we got no code hinting because it's not strongly typed. And we were going in and out of all the HTML and writing all this stuff to generate a list of HTML links with some dynamic data. Our syntax here is way, way cleaner. So using this structure of the model declaration and the var in our for each, we're going to use this pretty much anytime we want to display a list of data. Now, we've used an unordered list here. This could be tabular data. Maybe we're filling a drop-down list. We have a lookup table with master-child data. So when you're adding a child record, you need to select the master record in a drop-down. You know, we're adding a new album. We want to select the artist in a drop-down. So we'll use this same kind of structure, and this will go inside of select and option tags to generate a drop-down list. But all of the server-side stuff, it's all the same. What model is the list coming from? And here's our for each. One thing that bugs me, I'm surprised nobody's asked me this question yet, and I don't have a good answer for it. The syntax Microsoft recommends here, notice our at models all lowercase. Yet when we reference the model here, it's uppercase. Gets the model property associated. Why that is, your guess is as good as mine. That makes no sense to me. But if I put this in lowercase, it tells me it doesn't exist. Now, I don't know what happens if I change this to uppercase, if it will still work. Nope, breaks. Makes no sense to me whatsoever why it's this way. Yeah, just whoever developed that really didn't think that through very carefully. But it's important to note that you don't have discretion with this. The model declaration has to be lowercase. But when we're referencing that entire object, it's model with capital M. If anybody has a good explanation for that, I'd love to hear it because I can't understand that for the life of me. Okay. Let's see what's doing over here. That's 12:12. Any questions about what we've done so far with this view in our controller before we take a break? No questions? Okay, so let's take a 20-minute break here. When we come back, we're not going to do much more. We don't think we need to do much more in Visual Studio today in terms of coding this. We'll talk about some of the changes we're going to make next week. We'll push this up on Git. We'll try on Azure again. And then we're going to do our database setup as well as download some of the static assets like CSS and images that come along with this. Okay, so we'll get all that set up before we get out of here. And I will give you your first lab as well for the end of class. Okay, you have until Monday night to finish it. It's not due today. Okay, let's take a break here.